Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. And our guest today is Karen Hold. She is the founder of Experience Labs, and her work is grounded in a core belief that design thinking provides an enabling social technology that facilitates adaptation and effective problem solving in complex social systems. So there's a lot to dig into there in our conversation today. Karen began her career in business and strategy on the Folgers Coffee brand team in the early 90s, part of Proctor Gamble. She was influenced greatly by the work of, I'll call him the legendary management author and thinker, Tom Peters. Tom was actually the guest here on episode 58 of My Favorite Mistake. He's a big influence on me as well. Karen is one of the authors of the book, Experiencing Design, The Innovator's Journey. It's from Columbia Business School Publishing. And her website is experiencelabs.org. So with all that, Karen, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So I want to explore, and we'll talk about the book. I want to hear about some of your connections or the influence of Tom Peters and some other important people in your life and career. But as we usually do here, we'll dive right in. I'd love to hear your story. What is your favorite mistake?
So my favorite mistake takes me back about 20 years. I was working in telecommunications in the go-go years of the 90s. And my husband and I were actually working together. So we had a publishing company together, which meant we worked together, we invested together. And when the bubble burst, that also meant that our livelihood burst and our personal investments burst. So my favorite mistake, or I guess the mistake that I learned the most from, was not diversifying. Because I was working with my husband, all of our professional investments were tied together, and our personal investments were tied together at the time. So when the bubble burst, and I would say 90% of our clients went bankrupt within about 6 months of the telecom bubble bursting, I remembered something my father said, which was, Karen, the first principle of investment is to diversify. And I wish I had done that. We were having a lot of fun in telecom in the 90s, but it was a wise lesson to learn, because now as we begin to see all this new investment in the metaverse and exciting electrical applications with flying cars and electric vehicles, it's just a good reminder to stay grounded and diversified in those investments.
Wow. And yeah, that's a more immediate impact than having an investment portfolio or retirement portfolio that's not diversified. If you both lose your income at the same time, oh my gosh, that's hard to anticipate. You don't want to anticipate something like that could happen, right?
Yeah, you don't anticipate something like that could happen. And we didn't go bankrupt, thankfully. We hung on for a long time. We hung on for about 6 years thinking, surely this market is going to come back. Surely this industry is going to come back. And I remember a year after the bubble burst, I was sitting outside with a venture capitalist who had been a good friend to us. And he said, Karen, this market is not coming back for 17 years. 17 years. That's a long time, especially when there was so much investment in the telecommunications industry during the 90s. That seemed impossible to believe and impossible to accept. But, in the end, he was absolutely right. The market still hasn't really, the industry still hasn't come back. I think in large part because the industry has matured. And so it doesn't attract the same kind of wild overinvestment that it had in the 90s. But, it was a hard lesson to learn.
Wow. And for one, thank you for sharing the story. Thank you for framing it as a learning opportunity. I'd be curious to hear then from that learning, as you and your husband decided what to do next professionally, What, I'm sure there were some different choices, more
Yeah.
diversification in your work.
Yeah, yes. I ended up leaving the telecommunications industry. So I hung on for about 6 years. During that time, we had a daughter, and I spent less time in the industry than I had, which gave me time to think, time to read, and I married into a family of designers, brilliant designers, and so I spent that time really delving into new work, and that ultimately led me to my current professional pursuits and innovation, because I was so attracted by the work that my husband's grandfather did, and the role model that he was for me, and I was able to take a step back and really reflect on those experiences. So ultimately, I left telecommunications and I moved into the innovation space and founded my company a couple of years later.
And what did your husband end up doing? Was it, did he stay behind in telecom or find another direction?
He stayed in telecom. He's still in telecom. The industry has changed, obviously, since the bubble burst. But yes, he's still doing telecommunications work, and enjoys it. So he stayed in the industry, but I moved on.
Yeah. And did it take a while? You mentioned 6 years after the bubble burst. Was there a certain, like, how do you find the balance between trying to stick with it, disprove the person who said it was going to be 17 years to recover? Like, I'm curious, what was your thought process of stay with it, stay with it? Was it a gradual recognition of, okay, maybe I should move on? Was there something that prompted that more specifically?
Yeah, there wasn't any one moment that finally pushed us over the edge, or pushed me over the edge. I would say it was multiple moments of recognition that the industry has changed and it's not likely to return to the way it was.
Mhm.
And I think I had that conversation in my head all the time, right? That tape is playing. Is it going to come back? Is it not going to come back? Should I make a move? Should I not make a move? Because again, when you make a move out of an industry, you're also making a move away from connections. You're making a move away from a social community of support. And to make a choice to sort of loosen those ties and to leave that industry was not something that I could do overnight. And so I'd say those 6 years was really a loosening of ties, a loosening of relationships, a recognition that there were other things in the world to discover. And I think ultimately, when I reflected back on the experience I had had during the go-go years, I wanted that experience again. And I wasn't having that experience anymore. I wasn't growing professionally. I was hanging on, and I didn't like that feeling. I didn't look forward to, doing the work anymore.
Mhm.
And yet the world had moved on and there were exciting things to discover. And I wanted that again.
Yeah. Well, and you had made, it sounds like a career transition at one point of going from Folgers and P&G brand management. And then, well, I'd love to hear more about that work, and how Tom Peters, how his work helped you. But what was that transition from P&G into working in telecom?
Yeah, well, that seems like a really radical shift, doesn't it? So when I went to Cincinnati and I took my dream job, and it was my dream job because I'd read In Search of Excellence when I was a junior in college, and I was so mesmerized, I think, by Tom's writing, if I can call him Tom, Tom's writing.
I think he'd be okay with that. He's pretty casual.
And I was so mesmerized by the intentionality of the way the companies he wrote about in his book organized themselves, built their brands, and delivered value for the customers that they were serving. And I wanted to work for one of those companies, and P&G just happened to be one of those companies. And so I actually interviewed when I was in college, and I didn't get the job, but I wasn't going to be deterred. I came back to Washington, where I grew up. I worked in politics for about 5 years, and the work was too slow for me. The amount of change that happened in politics and in policy happens very slowly. And so I decided to go to business school and get my MBA so that I could go back to this world that I had read about in Tom's book. And then I interviewed with P&G again, got my dream job working on the Folgers brand. We moved to Cincinnati. And my husband had gone to the University of Pennsylvania and started taking classes at the University of Cincinnati. And after his first semester, he decided that he was bored. And I don't know how he did this without my knowing, he signed up for all second year classes, his second semester of his first year, and wrote the business plan for a new business. And so on our third anniversary in August of that summer, he and my father conspired to put together the incorporation papers for a new business. And he said, I'm going to start this new business and I want you to join me. And, I was still a newlywed. Here I was at my dream job, but I was still a newlywed. And David had this big vision. His grandfather had been a very successful entrepreneur. And I thought, this sounds really exciting. So it seems very unlike me, but I took a big leap. It wasn't without some pain. We had to leave Cincinnati. We moved in with my parents for a year because we still owned a townhouse in Cincinnati that we hadn't been able to sell. We bootstrapped the first year of our business, but we made it. And, within a year we were on our own. And within, I think, 2 years, we had moved out to Idaho, which was really a beautiful place to live and a really important place for our growth of our company, because we left behind the traffic and the busyness of city life to land in a very rural but beautiful part of the world in Sun Valley and Ketchum, Idaho, where we had extra hours in our day to think. And it was really that reflection and extra thought time that we had available to us that really allowed us to grow our business and aspire to do the things that we wanted to do.
And you mentioned, family of designers, and you didn't do the name dropping. So I'll do this because I thought this was fascinating when I learned this, that so I have this right. Your husband's grandfather was Leroy Grumman of the Grumman Corporation from the aerospace field.
Yes.
So that's and nowadays Northrop Grumman, but a legendary name in aviation. Yeah. So, I mean, what sort of inspiration flows down through the family of his work as a designer and an entrepreneur?
Well, his influence is extraordinary. First of all, he was a man of very few words. And I never met him. He died in 1983, and I didn't meet my husband until 1988. But of course, he was such a profound influence on the family, and the stories were a very important part of the family dynamic and the family culture. And so because he was a man of very few words, I learned how to use another language, because he really didn't use an auditory language to communicate. And my mother-in-law really was not a talker either. her favorite courses in college were drawing and design and color. And so I grew up in a family of lawyers. My dad was a lawyer, and he uses his voice every day in his profession. And so to marry into a family where you don't use an auditory language to communicate, it's not like they were deaf or mute or anything. It's just that they used a visual language to communicate. And so Grandfather Grumman really revolutionized naval aviation with the prototypes that he built. In the 30s, the Secretary of the Navy came to Grandpa and asked him to double the number of aircraft on aircraft carriers because we were losing the war in the Pacific and we needed to figure out how to get more planes up in the air. And most aviation executives were trying to fold the wings of the plane because all planes had fixed wing at that point. So they're trying to fold the wings up, and the wings lost the stability when you folded them up. Yeah. So the story goes that Grandpa was sitting at the end of this long table with all of his engineers, brilliant engineers, describing their ideas for how we could solve this, how he could solve this problem. And he was tinkering at the other end with an eraser and 2 paper clips and absorbing all of the information, but visualizing how the problem could be solved. He didn't speak a word. And the conversation ends at him, and he puts this prototype with this simple eraser and 2 paper clips on the table. And instantly everyone in the room knew that the problem that they had figured out collectively was really the problem of a pivot. And if you could fold the wing back like the wing of a bird, then you could maintain the stability in the wing, but also achieve the folding capability that was required to get that space saving that you needed on a ship. And so everyone in the room instantly knew what that meant. And none of it had happened with words, right? It had happened with this very simple visual prototype that was created with everyday objects. And then they took that simple prototype to the model maker and had a proper model made, and took that down to the Secretary of the Navy and put that wing design, a prototyped wing design, on the Secretary of the Navy's desk. And he instantly knew what that meant. So that wing design went into the Hellcat and the Avenger, which were really important planes for us during World War II and helped us win the war in the Pacific.
Oh, that's such a great story about the power of prototyping. Like you might know the one exercise that's used a lot, where you're trying to build the tallest tower that you can with dry spaghetti and marshmallows.
Yes.
He would have excelled at that, I bet.
He would have.
Because like the punchline, I think, of that whole story is that MBA students, and you have an MBA, I have an MBA, so I'm not speaking out of turn, that MBA students do very poorly in that challenge because they talk about it. They try to design the perfect design, and then they don't have much time to execute, where little kids start tinkering and experimenting.
Right. And kindergartners always outscore MBAs. That's right. I love that story.
So there's the power of prototyping, and that's come through in software design and startup methodology these days. And maybe we can come back to that point. But there's a quote that you shared from Leroy Grumman: "A rough answer to the right question is better than a detailed answer to the wrong question." And that really speaks to me, like a lot of the work I do, of taking a pause to say, have we properly defined the problem? There's a related quote from a different engineer, Charles Kettering, says something like, "A problem well defined is half solved." Similar idea. But I was curious if you could elaborate on Grumman's quote: "A rough answer to the right question is better than a detailed answer to the wrong question." Like how do you extend that thinking into entrepreneurship and innovation?
I'm so glad you picked up on that quote. It is one of the most important lessons that I learned from him. And I find myself repeating that phrase often, and especially when I work with innovators. reinforcing to them the value of just starting and doing, right? I think so often we think of prototypes as dress rehearsals for the real thing. And we don't spend the time trying to figure out if we even are asking the right questions. And it is so important to make sure you're answering the right question, because I think what's hard for innovators to believe is that most of the time they're going to get it wrong. Right? Because we're smart, we often equate that with being right. And that's not the case in innovation. In innovation, we are most likely going to be wrong most of the time. So go out, test your assumptions, find out what has to be true for your idea to be a really good idea, and then you will get to success. But by making those small bets frequently, instead of waiting and placing big bets infrequently, you can test your way to success and ensure that you are answering the right question and you're solving the right problem.
And I think that methodology, to me, it's in line with the theme of this podcast of learning from mistakes. Hopefully small mistakes move us forward in a way that prevent large mistakes. I mean, that's really what we're trying to convey here, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it's hard for most innovators to accept that we are going to get it wrong. And there is an expectation that we're going to be wrong. You know, in Silicon Valley, the investors who are at the top of their game, VC investors who are at the top of their game, for every 10 investments they make, only 1.8 are successful. And they are the very best at what they do. And we don't extend that same expectation to ourselves in innovation. We expect to get 10 out of 10 right. And that's just not the case. It's not the math. That's not innovation math. And so it's unrealistic to set that expectation on yourself and to set that expectation on others when they're in innovation.
Yeah, that's a good point where, VC investors are diversifying in a way that makes me think back to the story of you and your husband. That was unfortunately not a small mistake that prevented larger mistakes, but a good point of if somebody had only invested in Google, they would have really hit a home run, but chances are they invested in Google and another company or two that did okay, and then a few that were just complete flops. And like you said, that's to be expected. And I think it's a good reminder to the rest of us, don't expect perfection. Like even in a company, if we're thinking about different projects or different new products, is there a similar thought process of, well, maybe they're not all going to be perfect. They won't all be home runs.
That's right. And what I like to tell people is that if you keep an innovation inventory, then some of those products, services, experiences that you've designed may not be a home run today, but if you keep them in inventory, they may serve a purpose later. But you have to recognize that the way innovation works is that the number of ideas that you have, the large quantity of ideas that you have, will actually yield more successful ideas. It's not about having a high quality of idea. It's about having a large quantity of ideas that will get you to a good idea.
Yeah. So again, the title of the book, I want to come back to the book here, is Experiencing Design, the Innovator's Journey. And one of the endorsements on the back is from Roger L. Martin, who I'm a little bit familiar with some of his work when it comes to strategy. And when you use that phrase, what has to be true, if I'm correct, is sort of connected to his work on strategy, this idea of realizing you're not going to have a perfect strategy any more than you might have a perfect prototype, and that you have to move forward, iterate, test, evolve. Is that fair to say?
Right. And I think what's important for people to recognize is that you can't prove a new idea. You can prove the assumption, or you can disprove the assumptions behind a new idea, but you can't prove a new idea until you put it out into the market. So the most important thing you can do as an entrepreneur is identify the assumptions that have to be true for your idea to be a good idea and to create value. And then go about the process of validating those assumptions. And either you validate them and you gain confidence in your idea, or you invalidate them and you make an iteration to your idea so that you get to success faster.
And I think that's probably one of the goals of the book. And so one thing I was going to ask you, back in your bio, you use this phrase, talk about the importance of effective problem solving in complex social systems. So there's two parts that I was going to ask you to unpack. Maybe first off, going backward, what is a complex social system?
Well, I think that's every organization we work in.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
I think the way we do work in most organizations, especially most big organizations, is in silos. And often when we work in our own particular area of expertise, we are working with other people who use a similar vocabulary and have a similar background that we do. Professionally, meaning they've been trained in a similar manner. So they recognize the same language, they recognize the same types of data that are used for decision making. And it's comfortable because we have a certain way of working within our particular area of expertise. But then, other divisions of that same organization have also developed their own particular language and their own particular way of working. And so we've got these silos in organizations that function independently from each other and are not able to collaborate and build products and services together because they don't have a way of working across those differences. And what we know about innovation is that diverse teams create much better results than similar teams. And teams that have people with similar experiences and similar expertise. You have to work across difference within the organization. But we all have grown up figuring out how to do our work in different ways. And so without the social structures, processes in place to work across that difference, most organizations, let that go by the wayside. And they don't build those cultures of innovation that require work across those silos.
So what I hear you saying is one of the keys, then back to that first part of the phrase, the effective problem solving, one of the keys is breaking down silos.
Yes.
And focusing on, it seemed like another piece of it, and maybe this comes back to design thinking and what's in the book, understanding the customer, not just doing market research of would they use our gadget that we've created, but understanding, there's a related phrase that comes to mind from Clayton Christensen's work of the problem to be solved and the need to understand that. So how does design thinking help us in that understanding in a way that leads us to more effective problem solving?
Well, let's answer that two ways. One is that when we're working in those silos, I think what happens is some particular divisions of organizations think that's not my problem, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not the marketing. Marketing gets labeled as being responsible for the customer. When in reality, everyone in the organization is a part of creating the experience that you're delivering to a customer, whether it's a product or a service, right? But in organizations where there are strong silos, customer ownership ends up being somebody's responsibility, and it's usually not mine, right? We recognize customers only as data points, but we don't recognize them for the needs. Then the other piece of this is that when we do have responsibility for the customer, we have to move ourselves from understanding that customer from our own perspective and our own experiences to really stepping in to somebody else's world and giving them the benefit of the doubt that they might be having a set of experiences that are different from our own.
Yeah.
And that is the becoming and moving from egocentricity to empathy, which is absolutely critical in the work that we do in design thinking and really the work in creating value for our customers.
And, looking at the book, I mean, people might think a book about design is focused on, the product that you're designing or the service that you're creating. But, there's four chapters here on the discovery process. So why, for the listener here, the potential reader of the book, why is that discovery process so important to what happens during that process?
Yeah, well, let me back up one step and
Sure.
tell you that we wrote the book for the users of design thinking and really anyone that's doing innovation. Like you said, there are a lot of books out there that address the topic of how to make a better widget or how to create a better service. And that's not why we wrote this book. We really wrote this book for the people who were doing the innovation work to help them understand what it takes in terms of mindset and behavior shifts in order to do that work well. And so we've broken that into phases. We have a pretty repeatable framework format in the structure that we've written the book that creates some wayfinding for that. And you're right, we have a big section on discovery because we think that that first half of the innovation process, when we are trying to understand really what the attributes of our ideal solution are, require so many mindset shifts and behavior shifts in ourselves in order to be successful. And the rest of the work really depends on those fundamental shifts taking place in order for us to be really curious about the people we're solving for and be able to shift our own thinking to be able to solve for the people that we're serving.
Yeah, and I flagged the page here. It talks about some of these mindset shifts. That's not an easy phrase to say. Mindset shifts. I say that very carefully. I stumbled over it. It could have been worse. Things that, I don't do work in innovation per se, but when I work with organizations around continuous improvement, like I think there's a fine line or a spectrum there. But, for one, it says, the shift from needing to be right and avoiding failure to a mindset that's willing to be wrong. And maybe there's a part there of willing to admit being wrong.
That's right.
So I think listeners of this podcast are probably cool with the idea of admitting the willingness to be wrong. And then there's this other part here, or a couple things of, instead of looking for proof that I'm right, testing ideas as hypotheses and being willing to disprove your ideas, as you mentioned earlier. So if you could kind of elaborate on, like, is that easier said than done?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm working with a set of innovators right now who are riding what we call the innovation roller coaster. The days that your assumptions are invalidated is a steep dive on that roller coaster. And the days where your assumptions are validated is, a great ride up to the top. But it's this constant moving from validation to invalidation. And it's not a ride that everyone is willing or able to take. I would say that for a lot of people, I would say for probably 75% of the people that I work with, innovation is a fragile environment to willingly step into. A, because there's so much ambiguity, right? Again, back to this question about figuring out what the right question is to even be solving. There's a lot of ambiguity around that and a lot of discomfort that you have to be willing to accept. And not everybody is comfortable with that ambiguity. I often say that doing this work is sometimes like working in a hoarder's house, because you do all this research, you collect all this information, and then it's sort of dumped into this room, and you have to try and find the one or two gems that are going to really help you create real value for your customers. But that means you have to sort through a lot of junk in order to find those gems. And not everybody is willing to do that or wants to do that. And then when it comes to testing, I think finding out that you're wrong, that stings. There's no other way around that. Listen, we all identify as being smart. And like I said earlier, we often equate being smart with being right. And to find out that our assumptions are wrong, that stings. It's not for everyone.
Maybe it's possible to build up some toughness around that, or getting more maybe toughness isn't the right word. Comfort with that discomfort, and recognizing. I love your roller coaster analogy. Like the first time you go down that steep hill, if you don't hit the brakes, that downward motion gives energy to come back up, at least part way, if the next hill up isn't too steep to require the click clack mechanism that pulls you up. I guess a roller coaster is only fun because after that first big tall climb, the rest of it is just continued motion of the downward leading to the next uphill climb and
swing. That's right.
The next fun curve that makes you say "wee."
That's right. And that is the constant day-to-day work of innovation is the not knowing, right? You never know what's around the corner. And but you also never know the highs that you're going to experience, which I think are exhilarating for most people. And it sure is. I think it sure beats being bored day in and day out in a job that maybe doesn't provide that same sort of exhilaration.
Sure. Well, and it could be exhilarating to have a book published. So let me come back to the book before we wrap up here. Experiencing Design, The Innovator's Journey. With your other co-authors, was that an example of three women from different silos or different perspectives coming together to write this?
Well, I met Jean Litka, who's already a best-selling author. And I think this is her 6th or 7th book with Experiencing Design. I met her about 7 years ago, and she was writing she was just about to start writing her last book. And she sent out a call for papers or for stories, I think. And she was looking for stories of federal innovators in the DC area. And I'm based in DC. And so I think I just responded to an email that she sent out. Yeah. Said, hey, I'm working in innovation in DC. I know some people that are doing some interesting things. Maybe we could have a Zoom call, or I guess not even a Zoom call. I guess let's just have a call, and I can share some of my contacts. She said, well, I'm going to be in DC. Why don't we get together? So 3 hours later, after this wonderful coffee that we had, we started to share the work that we were doing, and she very graciously brought me into her world. And I often say that working with Jean Litka is like working with an Olympic athlete. She's at the top of her game. She's always pushing new boundaries. She's so eager and hungry for learning and research. And I just felt really lucky to work with her and to really dive into her world of research. And then Jessica was Jean's research assistant. And we were having so much fun, the three of us working together, that we asked Jessica to come and join us. So Jessica's doing a lot of great work. She's based in Philadelphia, and she's doing a lot of great work in this field as well. So I feel very lucky and privileged to have two amazing co-authors to do this work with.
That's great. Jean is at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia, a great school, of course. So I wanted to ask maybe one other question about the book, and it's a meta question in a way, not about the metaverse. A meta question about applying the ideas in this book to the writing of the book, namely, like with a book, can you test your way to success? And were there certain assumptions of what must be true for this book to have an impact or to be successful?
Absolutely. So we really used a design approach to writing the book. We immersed ourselves in the research, which is what we write about in the book. We made sense of the data that we found. If you had seen my office during that time, I had thousands of sticky notes on big blackboards that I used to try and find patterns in the data that we were collecting. And then, of course, we had to align all together on what we thought that meant. And sometimes we were aligned, sometimes we were not aligned. And we had to work through that, as any team works through, trying to develop a clear point of view on what we thought our data was telling us. And then we began developing some brand new frameworks that we had not used in any of our work before that could help us understand what we were trying to offer to our reader. And it was, and then of course because this is an academic book, we had to send this out for peer review before we ever published. So in that way, we did test it. We sent it out to colleagues of our own, but we also had to send it out as part of the peer review process. And these are blind reviews, so we don't know who was reviewing the book, and they needed to be able to tell our publisher whether they thought the world needed this book or the world did not need this book. I guess we did okay. They thought we needed this book. But at the very end, we were at the 11th hour, and we added a whole new section to the book, because in having conversation with the people that we were sharing our work with, and in really sort of wrapping a bow around the work that we had done, we realized that we needed a way for people to implement the entire, first chapters of the book, and we hadn't done that. And so we created this personal development plan that is at the end of the book. No wonder. That actually, we still had a publishing deadline. So we added this personal development plan. It's an analog copy that's in the book. But that set us on this year-long journey since we turned in our manuscript to develop an assessment tool that we just published 3 weeks ago that is really an add-on to the book. So the work continues. We had to publish it. We had a publishing deadline. And so we published what we had, but the work continues, and we're so thrilled now with the outcome to extend this work even further with this innovation mindsets assessment that we launched with our partners in London. We launched it with Treehouse Innovation. So anyone can take this assessment and understand their skill levels as it applies to the skill level that the minimum viable competencies that we write about in the book.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting assessment here. Many pages of things where people do evaluate their. It's fair to say, evaluate how far you are along in that mindset shift. How far along you are in the mindset shift.
Yes. And that's the innovator's journey. When we wrote the book, our working title was The Innovator's Journey. And at the 11th hour, our publisher said, we need to call this Experiencing Design. And then the second half tagline is The Innovator's Journey. And we thought, yes, that's exactly right. What we've written about is the transformation that you will experience in that journey when you experience design. And it really is that journey of becoming someone new in the process. And it's not a static moment in time. It is a journey. And the innovation mindset assessment will give you a snapshot of what that looks like today. And the personal development plan will then give you a way to help you develop as a person and work on those skills that you want to work on.
Yeah, well, that's great. So, Karen, thank you. I'm going to hold the book up again. Our guest today has been Karen Hold, the founder of Experience Labs. Again, the website is experiencelabs.org. The book is Experiencing Design, The Innovator's Journey, and it's published through Columbia Business School Publishing. Karen, thank you so much for not just sharing your story, but for the great conversation about the book and the things you're working on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a treat.